Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing my 5 bold predictions for the San Jose Sharks heading into the 24-25 season. Now let us start off immediately with my first one, which is that Yaroslav Askarov will play at least 35 games this next year. Now, in my Q&A a few days ago, I was asked the question whether or not I believed Askarov would be the Sharks' backup this next season, and I had said that even though he might not start the year with San Jose, could spend a couple weeks, maybe a month with the Barracuda, he'd likely end up with the Sharks, at least at some point next season. But I'm actually going to be taking that prediction a step further. Not only do I think he can play in that backup role, but I think he might actually end up in a 1A, 1B type of situation and get up to these 35 games played. Now this is for a few reasons, the first of which is that he forced his way out of Nashville, didn't really see much of a future there into becoming a starter, which was incredibly fair, but he also went so far as to say that he wasn't planning on reporting to the Milwaukee Admirals, the Predators' AHL team, if Nashville did not trade him. As we know, Mike Grier has gone on record saying that he does expect Askarov to be willing to play with the Barracuda, but for how long is kind of the major question. Sure, he might show up and play a couple of games here or there near the start of the season, since the Sharks still technically have 2 one-way contract goaltenders on their roster, but I doubt Askarov is going to be particularly cool with playing there for much longer. And as such, I expect that by November, perhaps at the latest, Askarov should be up with the San Jose Sharks as long as his performance is at least relatively decent. And it must be noted that the 2 goaltenders above him aren't necessarily the best of the best. They're not super impressive. You know, Blackwood put up a good performance for the Sharks this past season, especially in an incredibly tough situation, but at the end of the day, he was pretty much league average. But when we take a look at Vanacek, not only do the Sharks have zero connection to him as a goaltender, he hasn't played a single game for San Jose since being acquired by the Sharks in the Capo Kakinen trade with the New Jersey Devils, but on top of that, he was below league average this past season. I said he was with New Jersey. They were an incredibly talented team on paper, but yet they ended up missing the playoffs primarily due to the fact that their goaltending completely let them down, and Vanacek was a part of it. So honestly, Askarov, it shouldn't be all that difficult to actually outperform Vanacek, but even if somehow their levels are relatively equal, one would think that the Sharks would prioritize Askarov into getting these games anyway, because there is a lot of investment into him as the future goaltending the future of goaltending for the San Jose Sharks. In 1 year's time, Vanacek is probably not even going to be on this roster anymore. Meanwhile, the Sharks are likely hopeful that in 10 years' time, Askarov is still the starter for this franchise. And so you would think that the Sharks and Warsofsky and Mike Grier would want to give Askarov as many reps in the NHL as possible, as long as he has shown himself to be ready for that. So as long as he's not completely horrible and Vanacek completely outperforms him, he should be getting a decent amount of games. And yet another reason as well is that both Blackwood and Vanacek are relatively injury-prone goaltenders. We already saw Blackwood throughout much of this last season come in and out of the lineup, onto the injured reserve, off the injured reserve, which saw Kakinen have to play multiple games in a row, which saw even Magnus Krona near the end of the season have to play multiple games in a row. Devin Cooley got a few games as well in there because Blackwood was just not healthy enough to actually play. So realistically, there's a lot of opportunity here for Askarov to get this amount of games. My next bold prediction here has to do with the newest Sharks defenseman, or one of the newest Sharks defensemen this year, Jake Walman, who I predict will have 40 plus points this next season. Now this would be a pretty big career high for Walman. These past couple of seasons were spent with the Detroit Red Wings, and while he was on their top defensive pairing with Moritz Seider, it was not the defensive pairing that was looked too heavily to provide much offense. And so 40 points would be a pretty big overperformance for him. But the reason I say this is that the San Jose Sharks last season had zero talent when it came to offense from their back end. Not Burrows, not Ferraro, not Thrun, not Ruda, not anybody who was actually putting up even an okay amount of points. And so Walman coming here, who has shown himself to be at least a decent point producer, a decent goal scorer as well with the Red Wings, is likely going to be put into a position to have success offensively. He's going to be looked at to be the Sharks power play quarterback, to be the 6-on-5 situation defenseman, to be the offensive zone draw defenseman when the Sharks really need to be able to get a goal. Walman is going to be put in these positions at least to start the season to see if he's actually capable of it. But this year, what's different compared to last year is that the Sharks forward group has seen a massive upgrade. Not only are there expected step forwards for players like Eklund and Zetterlund, but also the new additions of players like Celebrini, Smith, and Toffoli. And so there's going to be a lot more help up front, which should help Walman, who might not be the guy who's going to be setting up these plays, seeing the ice so well that he's like an Erik Karlsson and could just make assists pop out of thin air. But when your forward group is so talented and you're playing a decent amount of time and you have even the slightest bit of offensive instincts, you should be able to benefit at least a bit from that. 40 points honestly isn't breaking the bank all that much. This is not a crazy number these days. Most teams have like a 50 plus, maybe even 60 plus defenseman, at least some of the better teams in the league. And so 40 here, even if it is a big career high for him, seems like it could be in the cards. Next, we have my bold prediction of the San Jose Sharks power play will be top 16 in the league next season. This is an interesting one because it should be remembered that there are 32 teams in the NHL, half of which make the playoffs, which means 16 of them make it to the postseason. So this top 16 number for the Sharks power play is not just some arbitrary number that I've come up with randomly, but it's to say that the Sharks will have a playoff caliber power play next year. And the reason for this is already last season, near the end of it, post-trade deadline, even after having given away Tomas Hertl, having given away Anthony Duclair, having probably the worst second power play unit ever in the NHL, that's not even that much of an exaggeration. The Sharks power play actually, if I remember correctly, was like 7th in the league over the last month or so of the season, which is incredibly impressive. And I already mentioned that the Sharks are seeing a large upgrade to their forward group with many new faces. Also, these rookie players who might not be able to take so much advantage of even strength play in the NHL because of the lack of space will be able to enjoy the extra time they'll have on that power play to actually show off their offensive creativity. Players like Smith and Celebrini hopefully to benefit from that. But also, with all of this extra talent, the Sharks' second power play will actually be intimidating. It'll actually be able to apply some pressure. Last season, it was pretty much the case where if the first power play unit didn't score, that would do it for the power play. Technically, they'd still have maybe like 30 seconds, 45 seconds on the clock, but you know that Luke Cunnin coming over the boards is not going to actually make anything happen in a 5-on-4 situation, even in a 5-on-3 situation probably. But next year, if your second power play unit is still featuring players like Wenberg and Will Smith and Fabian Zetterlund, I'd say you're in a much better position. And so already last year, without that personnel, they were looking quite good to end the season. If they can even somewhat carry that into next year, they might be able to put up a top 16 power play. Sure, the Sharks as a team will likely still find themselves near the bottom of the standings, but that would be quite nice to have anyway. The next bold prediction is that Macklin Celebrini will be a Calder finalist next year. The Sharks do have a couple of candidates for this position. Of course, besides Celebrini, there's Will Smith and Askarov, but there are a couple of reasons holding both of those back. I already talked about Will Smith in my Q&A, where I believe he'll kind of be bouncing up and down the lineup. Sure, he might get some top 6 time, but there might be some third or perhaps even fourth line ice time as well. Perhaps we've even heard from Mike Greer that he might even spend a bit of time with the Barracuda, so that will make it tough for him to be able to win the Calder. For Askarov, it's already extremely difficult for a goaltender to actually be able to compete for the Calder. The last time we saw it, I believe, was like 15 years ago with Steve Mason. This is because if you're a goalie, if you're a really good rookie on a team, you're probably coming up on a really bad team, since the really good rookies are drafted by the really bad teams. And if you're on a really bad team, you're probably giving up a lot of goals against, which means the goaltender stats, even through no fault of their own, are going to suffer. Askarov is a part of that. And even on top of that, Askarov would probably have to be in a starter position, playing at least like 45 to 50 plus games, which I don't think is going to happen with Blackwood still here. So he's probably out of contention as well. But for Celebrini, he's got a lot of things going for him. Not only is he incredibly talented coming in as the first overall pick, but he's also going to be put into positions to succeed for the San Jose Sharks. He's going to get the top 6 time. He's going to play with players like Eklund and Granlund and Zetterlund and Toffoli, these types of guys. He's likely going to have a very long leash as well. Even if he has a couple of games where he's somewhat struggling here or there, he's probably going to be able to remain in the top 6, getting good 15, 16, 17 plus minutes every single night. And of course, if his performance is actually quite good, that could be up at like 18 to 19 minutes. You never know what could be the case there. So Celebrini likely to be put into a position to succeed. And while I won't go so far as to say that he'll be the winner, a finalist does seem like it could be in the cards for him. Of course, it is going to be a relatively competitive year for the Calder. There is a lot of really good rookie talent this next season. I look at Matvei Mishkov with the Philadelphia Flyers. He was expected to be spending at least a couple more years in the KHL, but he's made the jump early to the NHL. There's also Logan Stankoven of the Dallas Stars, who took a page out of the Logan Couture book of being a rookie in the NHL, having played 24 regular season games this past year, as well as the entirety of the playoffs for the Dallas Stars, but that still technically qualifies him as a rookie, so it's not going to be an easy situation for Celebrini, but I do think a top 3 finalist could very well be there for him. And then finally, the last bold prediction is that the San Jose Sharks will be competitive. Now, it's important to note that I use the word competitive very lightly here. This does not mean that I think the Sharks are going to be winning a Stanley Cup. This does not necessarily mean I think they're going to be competing for a playoff spot, but I mean this in stark contrast to how they were last year. It is no secret to anybody that the San Jose Sharks last season were pretty much a free win for any team that had to face them. Outside the St. Louis Blues, who somehow managed to lose all 3 games to the Sharks this past season, otherwise, you pretty much got a free 2 points when you actually showed up to play against San Jose. You could come in, you could have one eye closed, a hand tied behind your back, one foot out the door, half asleep, on like no rest, everything like that. Every possible handicap in the book, and as long as you score like 1 goal in the first period, the Sharks would just collapse and give you the free win. This happened more often than not, and it's not even that much of an exaggeration. Of course, the Sharks, they still ended up with 19 wins, so they clearly surprised a few teams, including St. Louis, who I've already mentioned, but more often than not, teams could come in here and say, oh, I'm really worried about my playoff race. Oh, we're playing the Sharks? I guess that's a free 2 points, so nothing to worry about. Let's move on for these next couple of days. This season, for San Jose, I am hopeful, and I'm sure Mike Grier is expecting the Sharks to actually give teams a run for their money, to actually try and catch a few teams by surprise. You're not expecting them to be able to consistently win games over the Oilers and the Avalanche and the Panthers and the Bruins and the Lightning and these types of really, really cream of the crop types of teams in the NHL, but perhaps try to keep them on their toes a bit, perhaps try to surprise them with an actual solid performance. And when you go up against the more middle of the pack teams, or the teams that are near the basement, just like the Sharks are likely to be, that you're actually going to keep this competitive, that you're actually going to be threatening for a win. Because even last season, when the Sharks would go up against the really bad teams like the Arizona Coyotes at the time, they don't exist anymore, but they did last year, the Montreal Canadiens, the Columbus Blue Jackets, even those teams were like 20 points ahead, 30 points ahead of the San Jose Sharks in the standings, which is a significant lead in the standings there in terms of points. So the Sharks this year, sure, they're not going to be game breakers, I would say. They're not going to be competing for a playoff spot. They're still likely to find themselves in the basement, but if they can actually, put up a decent fight in some of these games, I think that would be a huge step forward from last year, and I do think that they will be able to pull that off with the improvements they have made this offseason. But that will do it for these bold predictions. As per usual, I do try to keep them a little bit more positive. I don't want to come in here and say, I think the Sharks are going to have 30 points. What a bold prediction there, because that's just a little bit depressing. So while these might not all occur, I do think that they are all within the realm of possibility, and it's fun to just be able to speculate about these types of things heading into the season that is starting in just about a week's time. Class dismissed.